I want to start with football
Yeah.
and this weekend being at basketball and kind of that presence. You and I have talked before about how you don't think things happen by chance, and Coach Rhule is pretty calculated. But I want to get into how cool it is to see the sports cross promote and overlap. If a rising tide truly lifts all boats, where do you see kind of the evolution of this athletic department and its overseer with its coaches as they as they try to dial in on this momentum that these sports are seemingly collecting?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on an important subject. I think the coaches over there, I sense, are more tied in together than they've been in a very long time. And I do think Rule has a big part to do with it. I think the way that he um, embraces all the other sports, embraces all the other coaches, makes a big point about when he's like doing a press conference and something's happening with this particular sport or that one, he'll always bring it up first, and then they put their money where their mouth is. They show up like the players and him, and they're just there all the time and they're supportive. And so like a thing like the dunk contest over the weekend, like if you just popped in the middle of like a March Madness run and didn't have a presence prior to that, I could actually see where that could be off-putting in a way. But
Mhm.
it's not that way because they're so well connected and everybody knows how much they've been supporting them along the way that it just feels natural. And it was just kind of like playing off each other and worked really well, I thought. And it got people to understand why there's hype about Jeremiah Charles.
So it's interesting. Trev was up at he was in Omaha the other day, and we had to take care of a couple of things, and we kind of got on this sidebar conversation. BC, I thought it was interesting. He said, he was talking to our athletic director, and they were exchanging big people ideas, and some of the words I didn't understand because there's a lot of syllables. But he said, people talk about what I do daily, and kind of my role with these coaches. And he gave an analogy. I'm curious to get your thoughts. He said, I'd like to just build a moat. He said, once you hire good people and you feel like you have smart people in place, regardless of sport, I want to spend a lot of my time building a moat around my employees and my coaching staff so they are free to do their job. So the state of Nebraska can see that we have some really good people in place. I'm building that moat
Mhm.
so those guys can do their job. Like, I didn't sleep all night. I'm like, I love the analogy because I need pictures because I'm not very smart. But can you see that happening behind the scenes that's freed these coaches to just be able to go out and work, knowing that your athletic department has a common vision?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I just think there's a trust factor in Trev, and I wouldn't say that if I didn't think it. I wouldn't just say it to say it. I just believe the coaches see someone who has their best interests at heart, is going to surround them with as many resources as possible to succeed. And is going to get, he can't lead them to the finish line, but here's the path, and he's going to give them the best possible path to do it from his job as an athletic director. And there's a faith there that I think is built up. I think you can see it between Trev and Matt Rhule, the way they talk about each other and express ideas about how each other does their job. And then I do think the piece of the coaches actually having that link together, even though they're in different sports and face different challenges within those sports, there is a commonality the stress and the hurdles of that job that are very similar. No matter if it's bowling or football or whatever, that you can find a common ground on, and it helps to have an ear to listen to or to bend an idea by. And I think nobody on that staff right now, it seems like, is afraid to go to the other and have those conversations from all the stuff we've been hearing. So I do think they're in a pretty healthy spot with just like how their coaches correspond and kind of the connection within the athletic director and all those things. So that's a positive, because how long, there's many years where we talked about, especially with Husker football, can they get the coach and the AD and the university brass on the same page. It feels like it hasn't been that way in a long time. And there was hope that it was kind of going to be that way with Frost and Moose and everything. And it fell off. And now it does feel real that's something that's working. And so you hope the other parts around it work.
We're talking with Brian Christopherson from Husker 24/7. BC, you kind of got my wheels turning a little bit between you and DB with talking about Trev there. And am I reading too much into it in what Trev tries to do for his coaches to look at it and say, okay, when Trev came around, that's when Fred Hoiberg and Nebraska basketball started getting better as well?
And let's not act like he didn't have tough conversation. That was a very critical moment, right,
because
BC?
We focus a lot on Coach Rhule and football and that part of it, obviously, but it seems like there's a pretty at least coincidental relationship between Nebraska basketball turning around and Trev Alberts showing up as well.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Now, I understand, Fred is a sharp enough guy to see that it just wasn't working the direction they were taking and is going to switch past. But I mean, it helps to have a sounding board and someone with good ideas like Trev giving his input on that too. And when you listen to him talk now, they kind of parrot each other when they speak of like having this type of team that like just appeals to the state, and like has a certain work ethic and, a certain hustle mentality that shows up on the floor that just people will get behind, even if you come up short on certain days. Like if you have that type of team where people feel like, man, they're going all after it and they work together well, I will support them. And there was 3 or 4 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago with basketball where that just wasn't the case. It wasn't just the record. It was just tough basketball to watch. It was just, they had some good individuals, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together well. And give Fred a lot of credit. He made some tough staff decisions, shifted a big assistant coaching piece around. I think, his assistants, now you talk about chemistry. I think they've found that like on that whole bench with like what everybody's role is and like Coach Lenzer, Adam Howard, Ernie Ziegler, all those guys have their part and I think know it well. And that's why you're seeing the team do as well too. Like, it starts from the top down and you're seeing a real formula of like how to work together and how to play off each other's best traits, I think, both within the coaching staff and on the roster.
Yeah, I'm not going to profess like that we're going to grab dinner and hanging out and stuff, but I think my discernment is okay when it comes to like gauging the character. It's interesting how I'm kind of seeing this shift with the department and kind of their philosophy. Like being a good person, I get it. It's relative to the user of the term, right? But like quality, like you talk about Coach like Nate and Coach Hoiberg and Coach Howard or Coach Rhule, Dvorak, like Coach White. You just think good people, right? How important do you think it is at this juncture, at this level in Power 5 sports, Power 6 if you're basketball, that modeled behavior is still a thing, BC?
Oh, I think it's always huge. Especially
we sure do undersell it though, don't we? Just win or
Yeah, maybe, but I mean in this day and age where it's never been easier and everyone around kids is going a different direction or saying, okay, I was here a year or two, it's not quite working out, I'm going to go over here. When you have a belief in the coach, he's going to give it to me straight. And I trust him because I believe in like his values and he's got an honesty and straightforwardness to him that, that I can appreciate. I think that really helps in these turbulent times where there's so much movement with guys when you have to have those deep conversations because they know that the coach has their best interest at heart. And, that just carries such a long way. So I think it's huge in this era. I don't think that'll ever leave, honestly. And if we do undersell it, that's a bad idea because I think, Nebraska puts out those football videos that people like, the shows, the little movies. And I think the thing that they really like to come across there, because they believe in it and they don't see it as a sales job, but just the truth is that there's a family over there and you can be a part of this family. And this is what family looks like inside our walls. And here's a little taste of that. And you can't put that on camera or probably represent, or you could, I guess, but it would be, people would quickly find out you're just selling them a bill of goods once they get here a few months, if you aren't really walking the walk as far as being a good person as a coach and just like being honest and all that stuff. So I think it's a huge deal.
We're talking with Brian Christopherson from Husker 24/7. I sometimes I bristle up a little bit when people use the term family in some of these situations, because I think there's two times people use that term. It's when they're trying to justify toxic behavior, but being like, hey, but we're a family. We can't, we got to stick together. Or sometimes it's a positive and they're doing it in hey, we have to have each other's back. We have to be there for each other. We have to sacrifice for each other. Right. And how have we been able to see that it was the latter, not the former, within the Nebraska football program?
Well, you got to prove it every day, but I think some of that is, if you want like evidence points, like even some of the guys who returned are an example of like believing in what they saw the first year. Like there was plenty of guys who could have went elsewhere. And we would have been talking about Nebraska's roster completely different if like Bryce Benhart or Ty Robinson or a Gifford or whomever decides, I saw this act up close for a year and it does not appeal to me. It's one thing in front of the cameras, it's another behind closed doors, all that sort of stuff. Obviously, they liked what they saw, thought they were getting better as players and maybe people through that first year. And so I think just some of the guys who came back is one example. And I try to have my antennae up, when I'm over there listening to interviews, and I realize people aren't going to say the worst stuff about anybody in front of the cameras and all that. But you can sometimes tell when there's a genuine like feeling, I think, of like, this is really tracking in a positive direction if we keep with it. And sometimes when something is being said just to be said. And there were past years when I think there was probably stuff where you could tell it was just being said with the cameras on because that's what had to be said. And I understand that by a player or something. I felt differently last year in a lot of those interviews. I really did. Just there was a belief factor of like, okay, it was hard at first. I didn't know exactly maybe why we were doing this or that, but I'm seeing the benefits of it now. And you could kind of pick up on that, just being a real thing. So we'll see though. I mean, you got to keep it going, and we're only 1 year into it, and everybody likes to talk good about what can be, so they still got to go do it. But I do think he's been very successful, Coach Rhule and his staff, at building cultures in a positive way, and they've dealt in very difficult frameworks too. When they were at Temple, in the Philadelphia area, there was a lot of kids with really tough backgrounds and stuff they had to deal with. And sometimes they'd have to send somebody home and he'd be off the team for a while. And there were guys who came back and, they ended up getting into the league and stuff and they worked it out. And so there was tough love along the way. But I think it goes back to Damon's question of, if you have that trust with players and build it up over time, even if there's a tough week or month or whatever, there's a realization, this guy really wants the best for me, and I'm going to see it through and just see what happens with it.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was just going to ask you something else, but I want to stay with that for a second. If I could back to back this, the prime example of a perfect example of what you just said, BC, is a guy like Tommy Hill, right? Obviously I'll go watch practice and I'll see interactions, and everybody saw the viral deal of the early suspension of Tommy Hill, and then Coach Rhule takes the picture and he's like, "Hey, who's the new guy?" You remember that, like when he was stretching at practice, and all of a sudden, Tommy Hill starts to flourish, right? He's kind of buying in, and I'm thinking to myself, Coach Rhule said something, and I'll never forget this. He said, I try to tell these guys, I want to operate in such a way that they trust me. So when we talk about my credentials, there's proof of concept. I've been here, I've done that. I've done rebuilds, I've been at the professional level. He said, and so sometimes I'll say to these guys, DB, why fight with me? I'm for you. Why not just do what we ask? Because I have your best interests at heart. Like, what are we doing here? Like, why would you want to argue with me? And it's so disarming and so powerful. I'm like, could I have even handled that at 18, 19, 20? Like, you mean you're for me, so just do what you tell me, because it's going to turn out well, right? Like, that's very, very important to him, and it worked with a guy like Tommy Hill.
Yeah, I mean, it sure did. I remember, I think I've talked about it with you guys, when the first practice or whatever of last spring, when Rhule announced like a few guys that weren't there, and Tommy was one of them. We were so used to it being a certain way, with like how coaches handle stuff. It's sort of like, oh, he's gone then, I guess, like you kind of jump to that conclusion, because around here it's been like, okay, he's not here today, he's probably not going to be here tomorrow.
I remember that guys would just like disappear. Yeah. Nobody would say anything.
Like, oh, they're gone, I guess they don't play football here anymore.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen a lot, but seriously, we haven't seen a lot of those like stories of guys who like, okay, he wasn't at practice this day, and then like 2 months later, he's like rising up the depth chart. That just hasn't been something. It sort of felt like when you got to that point, that was the end of the story. If a coach said, yeah, he's not around right now, we'll see what happens. That usually marked the end of that chapter. And so you had to learn the last year. It doesn't mark the end. Like, it doesn't mark the story on, I don't know what's going to happen with like Micah Mazuka, and I hate to like single his name out, but everybody heard him get brought up in the press conference the other day that he's got work to do. It's out there.
It's about more than just football, right? Or something like that, he said.
And I have no idea what's going to happen with that one, good or bad or in the middle, but the bottom line is, when I heard it, now I'm taking that information and I'm like, okay, well, let's see how it plays out. There's a challenge that's put out in front of him, but we've seen challenges with other guys. We saw it with Tommy Hill. We saw it, Anthony Grant didn't end up playing here very much last season, but he was a guy who was challenged in different ways, and he was still around and all those things, and Josh Fleeks and all that stuff. So, just because a guy pops up in a tough love way now doesn't mean it's the end of their story. And I think if you go back to his track record, what you were saying there, Damon, and you look at guys he had at Temple and maybe a few at Baylor, but especially Temple, there were players he can point to and say, I had a situation with this guy and it was rough. Like, he had a tough deal and tough family background or whatever, and he had to go for a bit, and then he came back and had success. And I know he had multiple cases like that where there were success stories. And so guys on this team, I think, know that he has that in his background. And there is a thought, like you say, if you think a guy's for you, you might not like what the person says for a day. You might stew about it for a week, right? But like, if your family, sometimes I'll get something, I've had something said to me, and you don't like it for a week or so, and then you're like, yeah, they're freaking right, so like, because that they want what's best for you. So that's huge.